Good day. Today is Tuesday, 30th December 2025, and as you can perhaps hear, my voice is still not fully returned, and I have been given very strong advice that I must husband my voice more carefully than I have been doing over the last few days in order to facilitate its full recovery. So, over the course of my last two programs, I've told myself and I've told you, my viewers, that I would make a shorter video than usual. And in the event there's been so much news and so many topics to discuss that the video has ended up pretty much as long as always. This time I'm going to try to stick more closely to the advice that I have been given. In the meantime, let me first of all remind you again to tick the like button if once you've watched this video, shorter as it will be, you nonetheless like the video and wish to indicate that fact. Now, the big news over the last 24 hours was a claim by the Russian government that over the course of the night of the 29th of December, last night in other words, Ukraine attempted to carry out a drone attack on Putin's Valdai residence near the city, the ancient Russian city of Novgorod. Now, the first report came from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He said on the 9th of December 28th, 29th, the Kiev regime launched a terrorist attack using 91 long-range unmanned aerial vehicles on the state residence of the President of the Russian Federation in Novgorod. All the drones were destroyed by the air defense systems of the Russian armed forces. And Lavrov went on to say such reckless actions will not go unanswered. The armed forces of Russia have already selected targets and the timing for retaliatory strikes. Despite this attack, we have no intention to withdraw from the negotiations with the United States. However, given the utmost degeneration of the criminal Kiev regime, which has shifted to a policy of state terrorism, Russia's negotiating position will be reviewed. So that was what Lavrov said. Then a short time later, the Russian Defense Ministry published this statement. In the period from December 28th to December 29th, air defense systems of the armed forces of the Russian Federation repelled a terrorist attack by the Kiev regime that launched 91 drones on the residence of the President of the Russian Federation in Novgorod. During the repulse of the terrorist attack launched by the Kiev regime over the territory of Bryansk region, 49 Ukrainian drones flying in the direction of the Novgorod region were intercepted by air defense systems during the flight. One Ukrainian drone flying in the direction of Novgorod was shot down over Smolensk region. 18 Ukrainian drones flying in the direction of the residence of the Russian direction of the residence of the President of the Russian Federation were intercepted over Novgorod region before 0700 hours Moscow time on December 29th, and 23 more Ukrainian drones were intercepted from 0700 hours to 0900 hours Moscow time. So that is what the Russian foreign and defense ministries have said. There's been some attempts by some people to say that the Russians have been giving different numbers of drones that they claim to have shot down and which they say attacked Putin's residence. My own personal view is that these differences are inconsequential. They neither prove nor disprove that the attack took place. They merely show that information about the attack, assuming it did take place, was spreading throughout the enormous Russian governmental system, and that it took some time before the various agencies of the Russian government were able to agree on exactly what took place. So, as I said, I think this is perfectly standard and normal. Having served, maybe not exactly within government, but very close to it, I know how these confusions can take place. And as I said, I would attach no weight to them. Now, that was what Lavrov and the Russian Defense Ministry said. But then, shortly after, we had a report from Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign affairs spokesman, and Ushakov discussed a follow-up telephone call that took place between Trump and Putin after Trump's meeting with Zelensky in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Now, I should say here that Putin and Trump had spoken over the phone just before Zelensky's arrival and before Zelensky's meeting with Trump. And over the course of that call, the Americans promised the Russians that they would call the Russians again to brief them about the meeting between Trump and Zelensky. So the Russians were awaiting the call. So this is why the call took place, and I will return to the very interesting information that the Russians have provided about this call and what it says about the diplomacy. And I will also discuss a very interesting interview that Lavrov has also given, which also touches on the diplomacy. But focusing for the moment purely on the alleged drone attack on Putin's residence, this is how Ushakov described the exchange between Putin and Trump over the course of the telephone call. Vladimir Putin drew the attention of his counterpart Donald Trump to the fact that practically immediately after what the US side considers a successful round of talks at Mar-a-Lago, that is to say, talks between the Ukrainians and the Americans, the Kiev regime carried out a terrorist attack involving a barrage of long-range unmanned aerial vehicles, an attack on the state residence of the President of Russia in the Novgorod region. The Russian side clearly stated that such reckless terrorist acts will, of course, not go unanswered and will meet with the most serious response. The United States President was shocked by this information, literally outraged. He said that he could not even imagine such irrational actions, and as was stated, this will undoubtedly affect the approaches of the United States in the context of working with Zelensky, to which the current administration, as Donald Trump himself said, did not thankfully give tomahawks. Vladimir Putin emphasized that the Russian side intends to continue close and productive work with its US partners in searching ways to achieve peace. However, naturally, with regard to a number of agreements reached at the previous stage and the newly outlined solutions, Russia's position will be revised. So the Russians are telling us, Lavrov has said, Ushakov has said, and Putin told Trump that the Russians are going to react to this attack on Putin's residence in Valdai by doing two things. Firstly, through a military response, and secondly, by reviewing the various concessions the Russians have already made and deciding whether, in light of what has just happened, it is still appropriate for the Russians to stick with these concessions. Now, that then brings me to the fundamental and big question. Did the attack take place at all, as the Russians are saying? The Ukrainians vehemently deny this. Zelensky says all the Russian claims about this attack are lies. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry is saying the same thing, that it's all lies. They are claiming that the story has been fabricated. And if you go to the Western media, especially, dare I say it, to the West European and particularly the British media, you will see that all of these lies are being accepted. They're being accepted in The Guardian, they're being accepted in the Financial Times. There's lots of assertive comments about this attack. France 24, for example, is saying that the Russians have provided no evidence at all that an attack of this kind even took place. So did an attack take place? Well, let's go back to what France 24 said, that there was no evidence that an attack took place. Well, I am not there. I have not seen the drones. I was not in the position of the Russian headquarters to monitor the incoming Russian drones. As I've discussed many times, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians provide me with details of their operations. In this case, the entirety of the information about the drone attack on Putin's Valdai residence comes exclusively from the Russians. And yes, you could argue on that basis that this is a case of the Russians asserting one thing, the Ukrainians denying it, and so that it's impossible to come to any secure conclusions about what happened. But if we have no actual concrete evidence about the attack itself, we have an abundance of evidence which does provide a strongly circumstantial case that an attack did take place in much the way that the Russians said. Let's start with Zelensky himself. Just a few days ago, on Christmas Day, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people. And here I'm going to read how the Daily Telegraph, a British newspaper, reported at the time his words. This was written on the 25th of December 2025. The article is by Emily Blumenthal. It appears in the Daily Telegraph. And it says this: Zelensky wishes for Putin to die during Christmas address. So that's the title of the article. The article then continues. Volodymyr Zelensky appeared to wish for Vladimir Putin's death in his annual Christmas address to Ukraine. Today, we all share one dream. This is a direct quote from Zelensky. Today, we all share one dream and we make one wish for all of us. May he perish, the Ukrainian president said. The comment was widely understood to refer to the Russian president, who has continued to bombard Kiev during ongoing peace talks. So, that's Zelensky speaking just a few days before this attack, this alleged attack on Putin's residence in Valdai. And he is making comments there which speak about wishing, all of us wishing, that he may perish. And the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper in Britain, which is utterly enthusiastic, fervid even in its support for Ukraine, saying that this clearly alludes to the Russian leader, to President Putin. I'm not going to look behind what the Daily Telegraph says. I think that is the obvious, straightforward meaning of Zelensky's words. So Zelensky, on Christmas Day, expresses his wish, his dream, which is for the death of President Putin. Just a few days, 3 days in fact, before the attack on the residence, the Valdai residence, took place. So this is evidence. I mean, one has to say it's circumstantial evidence, but it is evidence. We also have other evidence too, and that is That is, that it is no longer, I think, seriously disputed by anybody that Ukraine has a long history of conducting assassinations on Russian territory. So we've had killings of Russian generals in Moscow, including, by the way, retired Russian generals, in Moscow and elsewhere in Russia. We've had killings of innocent bystanders, like the daughter of a prominent Russian intellectual. We've had a significant number of incidents of this kind. And it is no longer, I think, seriously disputed in the media in the West that the Ukrainians were behind some of these attacks. And from time to time, very occasionally, the Ukrainians themselves confirm the fact. Mediazona, the agency, the site that collates Russian casualties and which works in close partnership with the BBC, counts amongst Russian casualties certain killings of Russian soldiers who have died during the period of the special military operation, but who have been assassinated by Ukrainian agents on the territory of pre-2014 Russia, whilst they were going about their lives. So the Ukrainians have a history of conducting assassinations inside Russia. They have a history of conducting assassinations on a very big scale in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk regions between 2014 and the start of the special military operation. Various prominent Donbass militia leaders were assassinated by Ukrainian special forces. Now, for a long time, the Ukrainians denied that they were involved in these assassinations, but some years ago, the New York Times confirmed it, and it is no longer disputed that these assassinations were indeed the work of the Ukrainians. Indeed, I understand that Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, was himself personally involved in some kind of operations of this kind, though I am not sure whether those were successful. Anyway, so the Ukrainians have a record for doing this sort of thing, for carrying out assassinations. What about assassinations, attempted assassinations, on the person of Russia's president? Now, here I am talking entirely from memory, but I can absolutely clearly recall, I have no doubt that this happened, an interview given by Kirill Budanov himself, in which he admitted that the Ukrainians have made more than one attempt to assassinate President Putin of Russia, though, as Budanov said, obviously, as at the time of his giving of that interview, which from memory was earlier this year, but I'm not going to try and confirm the date. Anyway, confirmation from the head of Ukrainian military intelligence that the Ukrainians have made previous, earlier, failed attempts to assassinate the president of Russia. I think I know of one such attempt, and this related to the incident of a Ukrainian drone that reached the Kremlin in, I think it was the spring of 2023, and damaged the roof, did minimal damage actually, but superficial damage to the roof of the Senate Palace, which is the building in the Kremlin where Putin has his office. I believe that this was clearly an attempt to attack Putin, whilst in the hope that he was working inside his office. The Russians claimed that the attack was aborted because they were able to jam the drone and bring it down. So anyway, we have Zelensky saying just a few days ago, on Christmas Day, 3 days before the attack on Putin, that he and all Ukrainians, of course, whether he's right to speak for all Ukrainians here is another matter, but that he wished for Putin's death. We have a well-established record of the Ukrainians carrying out assassinations on Russian territory against senior Russian officials. And we have, as I clearly remember, an admission by Ukraine's intelligence chief, Kyrylo Budanov, that the Ukrainians have in the past attempted, though they have failed, to assassinate the president of Russia, President Putin. Now, to me, again, all of this is circumstantial evidence. It doesn't perhaps confirm exactly that the attack on the 28th and 29th of December, the night of the 28th and the 29th of December on Putin's Valdai residence actually took place, just saying, but it is evidence that the Ukrainians are perfectly capable of doing such a thing and have very recently, just a few days ago, in fact, expressed a desire to do it. So I would say this is evidence, actually. As I said, it doesn't prove the case, but it goes a certain long way to prove the case. And of course, if the Russians are able to provide confirmation that the drones were indeed launched and all of that, then it seems to me that the case actually begins to become compelling. Now, I'm taking a very conservative view to all of this. I've noticed, by the way, that the various media outlets in Britain that have been heatedly denying that the Ukrainians would have conducted an attack of this kind and are accepting Ukrainian denials as true are making no reference, no mention of Zelensky's words expressing the wish to see Putin dead on Christmas Day. They are not referring, I don't think they've ever referenced, by the way, Budanov's admission that the Ukrainians have made several attempts to assassinate Putin. And, of course, they're not reporting, even though they've reported it in the past, the various assassinations that the Ukrainians have conducted on Russian territory. Of course, I am sure that they have information about all of these facts, but obviously they don't feel that this is the moment to discuss it. Anyway, so that's one thing. I am confident that this attack did take place. As I said, it is consistent with Zelensky's words spoken on Christmas Day. It is the sort of thing I can imagine the Ukrainians might do because they have done similar things and apparently, according to Budanov, attempted to do precisely this thing in the past. So there it is. I'm sorry if I've made rather heavy weather of this, but there are denials, and I think one should explain why in a case of this kind one opts to believe one side in preference to the other. I would add, by the way, that there's been lots of other activities that the Ukrainians have conducted on Russian territory. There was Operation Spider's Web, which is the attack on the Russian strategic bomber bases. There was the derailing of trains. There's been the bombs planted on the Kerch Bridge. There's been all kinds of things of that kind. So there's clearly been a dirty war underway for some time. I've discussed it many times now in many programs. I pointed out that there's every reason to believe that the Russians are starting to take counter-action, and I've no doubt that they are indeed going to respond to this particular attack, and that their response is not just going to be diplomatic, it is also going to be physical. In other words, there will be some military response from the Russians, as Lavrov and the Russian Defense Ministry is saying. Now, as to what that response will be, I am not going to make too many guesses, because this isn't the sort of thing that one wants to guess too much about in advance. It's worth pointing out that the Oreshnik missile is now in service. The Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, has said that there are now 10 Oreshnik missiles located on Belarusian territory, that all of them are operational and all of them could be used. If an Oreshnik were to strike targets in Kiev, given the distance between Belarus and Kiev itself, the Ukrainians would have no warning against it. No, there would be insufficient time for the Ukrainians to receive a warning, given how fast these missile warheads fly. So that's the first thing to say. The Russians undoubtedly also have operational Oreshnik missiles in Russia itself, and they're said to have a number at the Cosmodrome in Kapustin Yar. There are suggestions that they're more likely to use them against large fixed targets such as energy facilities and barracks and that sort of thing. So, of course, they might decide to do that in that case. There is a very strong possibility that the Russians will target the intelligence and security officials in Kiev who they may think were responsible for this particular operation. Undoubtedly, they have the resources and the means to do that, and I think there is a high probability that they will now do that. I personally do not believe that they will specifically target Zelensky or any member of Kiev's political leadership. First of all, the Russians have attracted a great deal of global support and expressions of support from world governments as a result of this attack. European governments may be completely silent. The European media may be spreading stories saying that this attack never happened and that, as the Ukrainians say, it is all a fabrication. But most of the other important governments of the world beg to disagree. So Donald Trump is shocked by what happened. That's what Ushakov said that he expressed to Putin over the phone. And Trump also made similar comments in a press conference, or at least when he met with the press after he spoke with Putin. He said that this is absolutely not the right thing to do, something like this while negotiations are underway. And Trump made it absolutely clear that he believes the Russian account and strongly disagrees with what he thinks the Ukrainians have done. But other world governments, also India, Prime Minister Modi has expressed his concern. The government of Pakistan has expressed its concern, one of those rare instances when India and Pakistan agree with each other. The UAE has expressed its concern. I gather most of the Arab states I have already done so or are likely to do so. China, of course, has also expressed its concern and its alarm. So the Russians are getting a lot of international support. And I think that they will not want to dissipate that by striking directly at Zelensky himself, by doing unto Zelensky what Zelensky sought to do unto them. From a Russian point of view, Zelensky continues to be the gift that goes on giving. He is mismanaging the war. He demands that Ukraine conduct the war mostly as public relations, as a public relations operation, rather than by observing proper military strategies. Just a few weeks ago, there was that meeting between Zelensky and General Gnatov of the Ukrainian General Staff, in which Gnatov told Zelensky that the Ukrainian military would be making decisions about Pokrovsk and Mirnograd based on the military situation there. And Zelensky immediately interjected, and this is all caught on camera, by saying that a withdrawal from Pokrovsk was unacceptable because it would damage Ukraine's diplomatic position. It would weaken its negotiating hand with the United States. So we could see that Zelensky consistently places issues of face, PR moves, if you prefer, above the actual dictates of the battlefield. And that has consistently worked to the Russian advantage. But there is something else, which is that the Russians have made little secret that once the war is over, they want Zelensky once and forever gone, and that they want major political changes in Kiev, and that effectively amounts to, as we shall see, something that closely approximates to, in fact almost is, a regime change in Kiev. And, well, Zelensky has now given them the perfect grounds for demanding that. Governments around the world generally are very opposed to regime change. But if President Lula of Brazil, if President Xi of China, if Prime Minister Modi of India, if MBS, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, all come along to Putin now and say, well, is it really proper that you should want to have Zelensky remain president of remove Zelensky as president of Ukraine and establish a government friendly to yourself there? Is it really proper that you should be pursuing regime change in Ukraine? Well, Putin is now perfectly positioned to say we have to have regime change in Ukraine because the government in Kiev is rogue. It is prepared to engage in these terroristic gangster operations. And obviously, you cannot expect us to coexist with a government as hostile to that and as unpredictable and as dangerous and as ruthless as that on our western borders. And I cannot imagine that Modi, Xi, MBS, or any of these people would push back on that very much from this point on. I doubt, for the record, that Trump would either. Just to say. So, from a Russian point of view, letting Zelensky stay in post, letting him continue to mismanage the war, letting him continue to rile and antagonize the Americans by making unacceptable and preposterous demands, having him undertake operations of this kind which solidify world opinion against him and make the Russian quest for eventual regime change in Kiev easier. Well, it makes sense, obviously, therefore, for the Russians to allow Zelensky himself to be left in place. And we can see that Putin himself has, up to now, stuck to that position, which, by the way, I remember him explaining carefully to the media some weeks ago, just to say. And I don't think this is going to change. Putin undoubtedly has given clear instructions to the Russian military to leave Zelensky alone. The Russian military has had ample opportunities to come after Zelensky up to now. And I think that Putin, despite the fact that Zelensky has just tried to kill him, is going to leave the situation, to allow the situation to continue where Zelensky remains president of Ukraine. That does not mean that there will not be devastating actions taken against other people lower down on the Ukrainian command chain. Ukrainian intelligence and security officers, some Ukrainian politicians who have been behind these events, the SBU and the GUR leadership in Kiev, all of these people now need to be very frightened and very worried, and perhaps they will be, just to say. But as I said, Zelensky himself, for the reasons, the very cold-blooded, tough-minded reasons that I've just outlined, I think the Russians are going to leave him alone. Now, the Russians have thrown in the possibility that European countries, other countries, European countries, or as they like to say, Ukraine's Western curators also had a hand in this attack. Now, they provided no evidence of this, and I would very, very much hope that that were not the case, but I'm afraid I can't be completely sure. Over the last couple of weeks, as we know, there have been several drone attacks claimed by Ukraine against tankers carrying Russian oil, or oil that was exported through Russia, so it might actually have been Kazakh oil on the high seas. There was an attack on a tanker off the coast of West Africa. There was an attack on a tanker in the Mediterranean. Now, I have previously said that I think it is inconceivable that the Ukrainians could conduct these attacks by themselves. They must have received assistance to conduct these attacks from someone. And by the way, I've had a very interesting email from someone who pointed out to me all the way back in June that he had received, and this is a reliable source, I should say, information that the Ukrainians have acquired and refurbished an old Soviet Foxtrot submarine, and that these drone attacks are being conducted against these tankers from that submarine, but that the submarine is being assisted and protected by 2 European countries. And, well, it's not difficult to guess that these are Britain and France. Now, let me say again, this is information I've had from a very reliable source. I have no corroboration for it, but it would not surprise me. All I would say is that I still believe that these attacks on these tankers cannot have happened without the assistance of some European power. And I do not believe that the Ukrainians are able to conduct drone attacks over these enormous distances, attacking Putin's Valdai residence near Novgorod without some external assistance as well. It might have come from Europe. There's suggestions, I know, that it might have come from some people within the United States. I have no information about that. I am confident that President Trump and his officials personally were not involved. But then I accept that the American government is a complex and huge operation. Many people within it strongly disagree with the president's policies and dislike the president himself. I think it's possible that somebody was involved from within that government, but I'm not going to try and guess or speculate who when I lack the evidence to do so. What I will say about this whole affair is this. The attack on the Valdai residence near Novgorod only makes sense if the Ukrainians when they launched their drones, believed that Putin was there. Now, Putin himself has recently been telling people that since the start of the special military operation, in order presumably to safeguard his security, he has resided almost entirely in the Kremlin, where he has an apartment. The Kremlin is obviously a much more secure place, or intrinsically a much more secure place, than any of the other many residences that the President of Russia has. It is worth remembering that the Kremlin is, after all, a fortress. However, I seem to remember, and this I am again saying purely from memory, some weeks ago, an article appearing, I believe it was again the Daily Telegraph, discussing Putin's Valdai residence near Novgorod, the very residence that the Russians say the Ukrainians attempted to attack. And there was a description, as I remember, of the various defenses and the security around this residence, and the fact that it is surrounded by bodies of water and is therefore difficult to access, and all of that kind of thing. And, well, as I remember, and again, I'm remembering this article purely from memory, people who want to check and drill down and find it can no doubt do so. Anyway, I remember that this article speculated, well, it did, in fact, rather more than just speculate. It strongly suggested that Putin, most of the time, is there, that it is in this particular complex that Putin has located himself, rather than the Kremlin in Moscow. Now, I think that is completely wrong, but then doesn't that fit very well with the attack that has just taken place? The Ukrainians launching an attack against the Valdai residence, perhaps assuming that Putin is there. Well, there was that article in the media in Britain suggesting that Putin's most usual place of residence now is Valdai, where he presumably feels safer. And, well, many of these articles that appear in the British media originate from the intelligence communities. So it may be, and this is just speculation on my part, that the story that Putin hides in Valdai has been circulating within intelligence circles and found its way to Kiev and was what led to this attack. Now, that's, as I said, a very detailed and in-depth discussion of the attack itself and of what the likely Russian reaction might be. Why did the Ukrainians conduct this attack? Well, it is not difficult to understand why. I have discussed in recent programs, and I'm not going to discuss it further today, the catastrophic military position that Ukraine finds itself in. There continue to be denials about this. The Ukrainians continue to insist that Gulyapolye is still under their control. General Syrskyi continued to claim this morning that the Ukrainians have positions in northern Pokrovsk. There are denials that other places, Mirnograd, have fallen under Russian control. As I have pointed out already, all of these denials fly in the face of the massive video footage the Russians have provided showing Russian soldiers raising flags throughout all of these places. So I have no doubt that the Russians are indeed in control of these places, and I have no doubt that the Russians are continuing their advance. And of course, the Russians are conducting hammer blows through the sky, through their aerial offensive against Ukraine's logistics, its military industries, and its energy system. And these hammer blows happen now regularly every night, and with the Oreshnik now coming into service, who knows, perhaps after this attack, they're going to escalate further still. So the military situation is terrible. The diplomatic situation, as we will see, is also terrible, but so is the economic one. Ukraine's economy is in crisis. Its budget is in massive deficit. Tax receipts have collapsed. And most importantly, the flow of money from the West is starting to dry up. The United States is not giving the Ukrainians more money. Apparently, Zelensky, over the course of the Mar-a-Lago talks, again demanded from the Americans directly more funding for Ukraine. He has written on Telegram, as I discussed in my program yesterday, that Ukraine needs more money. He said that air defense is not enough now, weapons are not enough. Frankly, there is a constant shortage of money, in particular for the production of weapons and, most importantly, drones. We need to be strong at the negotiating table. To be strong, we need the support of the world, Europe, and the United States of America. So Zelensky is most unhappy with the 90 billion euro loan. It is not as big as he expected. There are strings attached to this loan, which he doesn't like. And as I've discussed in many programs now, there are doubts about whether this loan will even crystallize, given that the bonds that are going to be floated in the international financial markets to raise the money for this loan do not have a redemption date. So Zelensky must be extremely worried at this time that before long, at some point, midsummer, the tap of money coming from the West will start to turn off. Ukraine is already receiving significantly less than it received from the West last year, and the flow, both of money and weapons, is starting to decline. So he's got that worry. And of course, beyond that, he's also got the worry that the Americans are beginning to turn and that they're no longer committed to supporting him. The various sanctions that he sought against the Russians have failed to materialize. The sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft have failed to achieve the effects that he intended. The Indians, Reliance, are buying Russian oil. I don't think they ever stopped, but anyway, the fact is they still are buying Russian oil. The shadow fleet, so-called, is now transferring wholesale to the Russian flag. Around 40% of the ships in the so-called shadow fleet have now raised the Russian flag. This is clearly an agreement between the Russian authorities and the ship owners. We will be seeing armed convoys provided to these ships as they travel and conduct Russia's overseas trade. So nothing is working for Zelensky. And as I have discussed in many programs, as we've discussed on the Duran as well, his political position in Kiev rests first and foremost on his ability to keep the flow of money to Ukraine going. If it stops, then that will trigger a crisis. And even if it begins to slow down, that will also trigger a crisis, because the various parties to the power game in Kiev will then maneuver frantically to get closer to the money flow before it dries up, and that could push Zelensky aside. So what does Zelensky do in this situation? Well, an attack on Putin, an attempt to take out the man who he must see as his, and let's say it, as Ukraine's nemesis makes, from this kind of perspective, a kind of sense. It's not a sense I would share. It's not something I would ever recommend someone like Zelensky to do. I think, on the contrary, it's a disastrous thing a disastrous thing to do. If the attempted assassination had succeeded, the consequences for Ukraine would have been even worse than those we are now going to see. But given everything that we have seen of Zelensky, at a point where he must feel he's got his back against the wall and where he's starting to get desperate, it makes complete sense that he would attempt to do something like this. It is not, in fact, difficult to understand the logic of Zelensky's actions. Now, this brings us to what happened in the discussions between Putin and Trump, and also in the meeting, over the course of the meeting between Zelensky and Trump in Mar-a-Lago. And we now have Ushakov's account. This reproduces the account of the Mar-a-Lago meeting that Trump gave to Putin over the course of their telephone call. Again, to repeat, I am not there. This account comes from Ushakov, but the Americans are not denying it, and I believe that it is true. And this is what Ushakov says. In their presentation, the Americans said that during these talks, the US side took an assertive stance in promoting the idea that Kiev needs to take real steps towards the final settlement of the conflict instead of using demands for a temporary ceasefire as cover. Zelensky was advised to not even try to secure a respite for his armed forces, but instead focus on achieving a comprehensive agreement that would lead to the actual end of the armed conflict. Donald Trump informed the president of Russia about certain results achieved by Zelensky's team precisely in this direction, but which nevertheless, in our opinion, ours is the Russians, the Kremlin's opinion, still leave the Ukrainian authorities room for various interpretations in order to evade fulfillment of their commitments. So, what apparently happened in Mar-a-Lago was that the Americans told Zelensky, forget about a ceasefire, forget about a freeze of the conflict, forget about the Kellogg plan. Kellogg is gone. He's no longer here. He's not even in this room. He's still nominally the peace envoy, but he's going in January, and you deal with the people you are meeting today, with the president himself, Donald Trump, with Secretary Rubio, with Witkoff, and with Kushner. And by the way, I understand that all of these people were also parties to the telephone call, this latest telephone call between Trump and Putin. So forget about freezes of the conflict, forget about ceasefires. What we now need to do is to move forward with a situation where we can start negotiating with the Russians seriously about a comprehensive peace, a comprehensive, secure, and final peace. We've gone back to the position we took in Anchorage in Alaska when we agreed with the Russians that a ceasefire is not a viable option, and that's what we are telling you, and you must drop all ideas of a ceasefire, which we can see, just as the Russians can see, are basically maneuvers in order to try to avoid making the fundamental concessions you need to make in order to end the war. Now, that is not going to be a message which Zelensky would have wanted to hear at all. His entire diplomatic strategy ever since March has been to try to get the Americans to pressure or bribe or bully the Russians, mostly bully the Russians, into agreeing a ceasefire on the existing conflict lines with the quite transparent objective of rearming and rebuilding the Ukrainian army and giving it a respite so that eventually when the war is resumed, it can be resumed again from a position of strength. Zelensky probably calculates that this is the only compromise he can make if he is going to preserve his regime. So he will not have been happy that the Americans told him all this. And of course, he will have gone to the meeting in Mar-a-Lago fully anticipating that this is what the Americans were going to say. Trump had already publicly trashed Zelensky's 20-point plan. He said that a plan is only meaningful if I, Trump, approve it, clearly hinting that he was not going to approve it. So this time, finally, it looks as if the Americans told Zelensky once and for all, you're running out of road. We're not prepared to go on giving you money. We're not prepared to go on giving you weapons. You are losing the war despite all your various denials and pretenses, and we're not going to fund you, and we're not going to arm you. And if you can get money and arms from your European friends, you're welcome. But as we know, those friends in Europe are not able to provide the weapons and the money that Zelensky has been wanting. So, again, one can see that Zelensky has his back up against the wall, that he is getting desperate. And, well, he is probably aware of an interview that Putin has given, that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has given to the Russian media, in which he again sets out how the Russians see the war ending and the contours of any peace agreement. He says that there must indeed be elections, that the elections that legitimacy in Ukraine can only be conferred through elections. The Ukrainian people, including the vast majority of their compatriots now residing in Russia, must finally be given the opportunity to determine their own future, so that there must be no Moldovan arrangement whereby the Ukrainian diaspora in Europe and Canada votes, and the Ukrainian diaspora in Russia doesn't. And Lavrov continues, the organization of such a vote must not be used as a pretext for a temporary ceasefire to facilitate Ukraine's rearmament. And then Lavrov goes on to say this, elections are not an end goal in themselves. The priority must be establishing legally binding guarantees that address the root causes of this conflict, the foundational principles upon which Ukrainian statehood was recognized by Russia and the international community must be restored. This entails enshrining Ukraine's neutral, non-aligned and nuclear-free status, achieving its demilitarization and denazification, halting the NATO countries' military development of Ukrainian territory, the rights and freedoms of native Russians and Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine must be guaranteed, and the persecution of the canonical Orthodox Church must cease. Further, Kiev and its Western sponsors must recognize the new territorial realities following the accession of Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, Lugansk, and the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions to the Russian Federation. And on the subject of security guarantees for Ukraine, Lavrov had this to say: a viable system of security guarantees must be established. In this context, we extended a formal invitation for dialogue to the United States in September. So way back in September, the Russians said, let's discuss security guarantees for Ukraine. But of course, as we will see from Lavrov's next words, not only for Ukraine. We are confident that the draft treaties submitted by Russia to Washington and European capitals in December 2021 can serve as a substantive basis for relevant discussions. Any such guarantees must, of course, be founded on the principle of the indivisibility of security as enshrined in the consensus documents of the ODYSEE summits in Istanbul and Astana. So, in other words, the Russians are returning to the December 2021 treaties, and they see any security guarantees for Ukraine in the context of those treaties. And those treaties precluded further NATO expansion. On the contrary, they required NATO to dismantle its entire military establishment in Eastern Europe and to transfer it back to the territory of Germany, reverting back to the military balance as it existed before NATO expansion began in 1998. So that is what the Russians are thinking about. And yes, I don't for one microsecond believe that the United States will ever agree to such a sweeping proposal. But they're not going to reject. This administration is unlikely, or so the Russians may believe, to reject it outright. Because going back to the wording of the US's recent security strategy review, what did it say? It is a core interest of the United States to negotiate an expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine in order to stabilize European economies, prevent unintended escalation or expansion of the war, and re-establish strategic stability with Russia, as well as to enable the post-hostilities reconstruction of Ukraine to end its survival. And it is also a core interest of the United States to achieve stability in Europe. So that is America's strategy. And the Russians apparently have already been telling the Americans, they were telling the Americans before this strategic security strategy document was published, they were already telling the Americans back in September, we understand that you want to discuss security guarantees, both for Ukraine and perhaps more extensively. Let's do it by discussing the general security architecture in Europe. You want stability in Europe. You want stability in your relations with us. We understand why. You've got lots of other problems on your plate and you want to focus on those. We are prepared to help you with this. We want stability on our western borders. So let's sit down and talk about this and let's agree. So you could see that lots of pieces are moving, and they're moving in ways that not only Vladimir Zelensky won't like, but many governments in Europe won't like either. Any arrangement that creates the kind of security architecture for Europe that Lavrov is talking about would create enormous panic in Europe. And now we see the Russians confirm that discussions of that precise kind between the Russians and the Americans are, in fact, at some level at least, underway. And I would suggest that explains much of the current war hysteria in Europe. And it also explains the panic in Kiev, which in turn explains the attack on Putin's residence that took place 2 days ago. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our Substack site. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this platform. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.